So this David Pakman guy makes a video called The Truth About Race and IQ, and it's really something.
It is time for the long-awaited deep dive into race and IQ that we've been working on. A lot of time has gone into this. Producer Noah Ferguson has done some great research, and this is exactly the type of work that we can do more of the more support we have from you. Remember, membership, Patreon, if you like this type of detailed video and audio investigation.
At one point, he brings up the 1950 UN Statement on Race, saying it doesn't exist.
The United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization declared as early as 1950 that there is no such thing as race in biology, based on the findings of an international panel of leading anthropologists, geneticists, sociologists, and psychologists.
And I went, hold on, I read that a while back, and it says no such thing. From the statement, quote, "From the biological standpoint, the species Homo sapiens is made up of a number of populations, each of which differs from the others in frequency of one or more genes. A race, from the biological standpoint, may therefore be defined as one of the group of populations constituting the species Homo sapiens. These populations are capable of interbreeding with one another, but by virtue of the isolating barriers which in the past kept them more or less separated, exhibit certain physical differences as a result of their somewhat different biological histories. In short, the term race designates a group or population characterized by some concentrations relative as to frequency and distribution of hereditary particles, genes, or physical characters, which appear, fluctuate, and often disappear in the course of time by reason of geographic and or cultural isolation." So what happened is that you have these people who made this video, whoever did the research for this video, who just hear secondhand what this statement says, never read it themselves, and then go, oh yeah, they say races don't exist, when really it says no such thing.
A lot of time has gone into this.
Good day for a swell battle. And begin!
At one point, Pakman claims that Henry Goddard's IQ test influenced the 1924 Immigration Act. There are two problems with this. The first is that the results from IQ tests were never brought to the floor when arguing for the act and were ostensibly only brought up a few times in committee. Quote, "The testing community did not generally view its findings as favoring restrictive immigration policies like those in the 1924 Act, and Congress took virtually no notice of intelligence testing as far as one can ascertain from the records and publications at the time. In addition, Henry Goddard himself, along with the rest of the testing community, did not support immigration restrictions on the basis of his tests. Quote, he, Goddard, said explicitly that his study, quote, makes no attempt to determine the percentage of feeble-minded among the immigrants in general or even of the special groups named, the Jews, Hungarians, Italians, and Russians. Assuming for the sake of argument that the percentages and mental levels shown in the foregoing results are approximately correct, what is to be done about it? Shall we say they are feeble-minded and we want no feeble-minded persons in the country, at least no more than we can produce ourselves? That is undoubtedly a very TLDR quote where Goddard says, using old-timey words, that he thinks that the IQ differences between Europeans are mostly a result of environmental differences, not genetic differences, and he opposes the 1924 Immigration Act. So, two key problems with Pakman's argument is that there's no evidence that IQ tests influenced the 1924 Immigration Act, and Henry Goddard himself opposed it and was an environmentalist in regards to IQ differences between the European groups named.
Remember, membership, Patreon.
Throughout the video, Pakman likes to bring up consensus. Oh yes, the great consensus. Now, first off, he's just wrong. We have two surveys of intelligence researchers from 2013 and 1984, and the median estimate in 2013 on the percentage of the black-white IQ gap that's a result of genetic differences is 50%. Now, I think it's 80%, so you could say I deviate from the consensus a bit, but I'm closer to the consensus number than anyone who says it's 0 or near 0. The 1984 survey was weird in that it didn't ask for a numerical estimate, so what we see is the mode being a mixture of genes and environment, then insufficient evidence to make any kind of conclusion, then an environmental determinism, then no response, then genetic determinism. On the existence of race, the data is old, but in NATO countries, about 1/3 of physical anthropologists recognize biological race. In former Soviet and Warsaw Pact countries, it's about 2/3 recognize race, and in China, it's nearly 100%. The trend in the former Soviet Union and Warsaw Pact is toward race recognition, the trend in NATO countries, or the West as it's called, is no trend, no change. And I don't know what the trend is in China, but if race recognition is already at 100%, then there's only one direction it could go. I have no data on geneticists and no recent data on biologists. However, from the older data from biologists from the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, biologists have always been more likely to recognize race than physical anthropologists were, at least in the West. So, if 33% of physical anthropologists in the West recognize race today, our best guess for biologists in the West recognizing race today is 48%, given what the ratios were in the past. Sure, the data is spotty, but it's a lot better than some pious statements from organizations that claim to represent all anthropologists or all psychologists or all doctors or whatever. So yeah, the Student Body Council passed a resolution drawn up by the finest cat ladies they could find, and they made some real serious faces while saying all the correct things that wouldn't cause conflict in the boardroom. No, this isn't like evolution or even like global warming. This is like half or more of the relevant experts recognize biological race, and there's no real trend in any direction except in the former Soviet Union and Warsaw Pact, where the trend is towards race recognition.
Producer Noah Ferguson has done some great research.
Throughout the video, Pakman engages in what I consider the equivalent of topicality arguments in debate, denying race and denying the validity of IQ from the get-go. His only on-case arguments was citing two studies, one done by Capron and one done by a guy by the name of Turkheimer. And just as an aside, this shit is not okay. Citing studies hidden behind paywalls to where people just have to take your word for it is total garbage. And in the age of the internet, it's completely inexcusable. Find a real link or Sci-Hub it or something, but don't do this. I was surprised he cited Capron given how obscure the study is and given that it's 28 years old. Now, I'll show you the results table from Capron and you can tell me what pops out at you. Okay, how about now? One of the cohorts had 8 people in it. Now, this isn't a bad paper. It's an interesting hypothesis, and he has a little bit of confirmation for his hypothesis, more research needed. But if you're using a study from 1989 in France with a cohort size of 9.5 as a backbone to your argument against divergent evolution in humans, I'm sorry, but that's a sanity test fail there. One study from McGew in 2005 showed that non-adoptive offspring IQ varied massively with general socioeconomic status, which makes sense. But the million-dollar question, of course, is this because of their genes or the environment they get from their parents? Well, McGew tracked 409 adopted offspring, looked at their IQs by the parental socioeconomic status of their adopting parents, and they found that the socioeconomic status of the adopting parents didn't matter for the adopted children, which is very suggestive that the variation in IQ among the non-adopted children was down to genetic differences, not differences by socioeconomic status. A study by Asbury, Wachs, and Plomin in 2004 tried to replicate Turkheimer's results, and they too found similar heritabilities at all socioeconomic statuses for adoptees, saying, quote, "This suggests an opposite effect to that reported by Turkheimer et al. The discrepancy between these findings may reflect unmeasured differences between US and UK populations, or perhaps differences in the types of measure or methods of data collection used." Another study by Nagoshi and Johnson from 2005 looked at adopted offspring in Hawaii and also failed to replicate Turkheimer's finding of a lower heritability in poorer families, saying, quote, "In contrast to the findings of Turkheimer et al. 2003, there was no evidence in these data that familiarity for cognitive abilities was lower in the lower as opposed to the upper levels of socioeconomic status. These results were consistent across measures, ethnicity, and sex of offspring."
The long-awaited deep dive into race and IQ that we've been working on.
And that's really as good as it gets. Most of his video is a real silly deconstruction of race. He repeats the old standby, more variation within than between, and in other videos I break down why this is wrong, but given time limitations here, I'll just point out that this is also true when comparing humans and chimpanzees. The more variation within Homo sapiens and chimpanzees than between Homo sapiens and chimpanzees, it has to do with a variation being being a result of genetic drift versus variation that is a result of selection, and also the fact that not all genes are equally important in terms of phenotype. I've also gone over previously how using standards used to define subspecies in other animals, one can clearly see that humans have both enough total variation to have subspecies and that variation clusters discretely enough to have subspecies if we use other animals as a benchmark. You can deconstruct or reify whatever you want. You can come up with a schema that says there are two races, Africans and non-Africans, or you can come up with a schema that says there are 1,000 races or 7 billion races. Every man his own race. And the point is that the arguments used to deny races in humans would also deconstruct subspecies in several wild animals with generally accepted subspecies. Pakman also claims that there are countless category schemes for race. First off, not really. The 6 to 9 race model that is common today is just the races of man. There's no name for it because it's not a particular school or category schema, it's just the reality that everyone sees, and some people try to deny. As far back as 1779, Friedrich Blumenbach divided man into 5 race categories. Caucasian, Mongoloid, that's the Chinese and Japanese.
So are you Chinese or Japanese?
First come from Laos.
Huh?
Laos. We lay ocean.
The ocean? What ocean?
We all lay ocean. From Laos, stupid.
So are you Chinese or Japanese?
Ugh.
Malay, that's Southeast Asians and Polynesians. Negroid, American, referring to Amerindians, not the European settlers. Today, we would clearly distinguish Australians and New Guineans from Black Africans, and we would divide Caucasians at least between European and non-European, maybe even further. And certainly by 1870, we can look at Thomas Huxley's racial divisions, and this is basically it. This is basically what we have today. And we can go as far back as ancient Egypt and see that they defined the people around them the way we do today. The Greeks and Nubians were distinct from what the Egyptians were, which today we would call non-European Caucasians. Even Brazilians think this way. Don't make that dumb argument. I've shown previously studies that show that Brazilians don't actually think in terms of the weird census categories that Brazil uses. They see race just the same as you and I do.
And this is exactly the type of work that we can do more of the more support we have.
Now, I could go into all of Pakman's nonsense little claims, but I think it would be more productive to just explain how this works and ignore what he says. There are 2 ways of dividing a population into clusters. One is k-means, and the other is structure. I understand k-means better, so I'll just explain the k-means method here. In k-means, you give a program a bunch of genetic data from a bunch of people, and you tell it to divide it into a certain number of clusters. You can tell it to divide it into 2 or 200 clusters. And there have been several papers that did this. They asked what their race was. Those were the categories used. So if you have 5 different answers for people saying what their race is, or 5 answers that make up 95% of the responses, some people can say some stupid things and you can ignore that or say other. The researchers will say, okay, computer, divide all this genetic data we got from these people into 5 clusters. And reliably, you get over 99% correspondence between the two, between best fit cluster and self-identified race. If you want to know what race someone is, just ask them. And the difference between what they say and what the best fit cluster is going to be is negligible. Even Hispanic, which no race realist would ever say is a race, actually clusters fairly well. Better than you probably thought that whites or blacks would cluster. Pakman also talks about mixed race populations as if that's some horrible conundrum. As seen above, we can divide them up just fine, thank you very much. And really, it's just the opposite. Mixed populations allow us to do admixture studies. We can look at the proportion of Amerindian, African, European, East Asian admixture, or whatever, and see how admixture correlates with all sorts of traits. And then see, on average, what effect does having 10% more Amerindian admixture have on all sorts of traits that a person has. Pakman brings up how there are no race genes, and this is a really pubby talking point. The way it actually works is with variants at gene locations. Allele refers to the variant, loci or loci is the location, and all humans have the same gene locations. It's just that at each location you have different variants of a gene, and populations differ in allele frequencies or gene variant frequencies at these locations, but they all have the same locations. And all the genes do the same things, just differently depending on this or that SNP being different. And for some perspective, we can compare the male-female genetic differences to the race genetic differences. You can treat male-female genetic differences as just an allele frequency difference. It's just that it's an allele frequency difference of 100% at a very small number of locations. While the allele frequency differences between the races aren't typological, like the gender differences, i.e. you don't have race genes, they're spread out over many more genes. And so if we assume that every single gene on the Y chromosome differs from the analog genes it deactivates on the X chromosome, then the FST distance between males and females would be 0.021, which is just slightly more than 1/8 of the difference between Europeans and Africans in terms of magnitude. So you have gender genes, but you don't have race genes. But so what? The total magnitude of the allele frequency differences between the races completely dwarfs gender differences. He also says a bunch of whoppers about IQ. He first says that IQ isn't intelligence, and that intelligence is this incredibly, irreducibly complex thing. But the whole point of the general intelligence factor, or the G factor, is that it's really not. And while this is all inferential, what psychometricians have found is that there's your IQ score, and that's nice, but what really matters is an underlying general intelligence factor. Some tests are more G-loaded than others. If you have someone who does well on a highly G-loaded test, those people are not only better at other random tests you give them right in that moment straight away, but it's also easier for them to improve their overall IQ scores. People who do better on the G-loaded subtests of an IQ test have a much easier time improving their IQ, overall IQ in the future. And this goes back to what Pakman said about Raymond Cattell. Raymond Cattell didn't predict that nominal IQ scores would go down. He predicted that G would go down, or the general intelligence factor would go down. And it has. Full-scale IQ scores have increased from when Raymond Cattell made his prediction, but G has fallen. Pakman repeatedly brings up the rising nominal raw IQ scores over time. And first of all, the rise in raw scores has just straight up stopped in Western countries. In the US and Western Europe, nominal IQs are straight up falling. But it's irrelevant because IQ in and of itself is irrelevant. The only reason we care about IQ is because IQ tests tend to be very G-loaded, as in they tend to be very good predictors for your performance on other tests and, more importantly, in the real world. But rising IQ scores over time, this is about as meaningful as rising heights over time. We know that IQ is about 80% heritable within the US, and height is also about 80% heritable in the US and in Western countries. Heights are greater than they were in the past, therefore what? Therefore the gap in height between men and women is totally down to environment, because women today are taller than men were in 2000 BC? It's the same form of argument you get from the rising IQs. Also, the guy who was considered the father of the G factor and made the G factor the dominant paradigm in intelligence research was Arthur Jensen. And so when Pakman says he is known for academic racism, you're just really, really full of shit when you say that. And that's very cavalier of you to just go in and say this stuff about people that you know fuck all about. Arthur Jensen was a liberal who looked into the G factor because he thought that if he could show that the races had more or less the same general intelligence factor, that would be evidence that the current gaps in nominal IQ scores or full-scale IQ scores were down to the environment. But he found the opposite, that the more environmentally and culturally influenced an IQ subtest is, the smaller the racial gaps are. For example, the black-white gaps are smaller on vocabulary, arithmetic, and information. And it's funny having all these shitlibs saying to remove culturally biased questions on the IQ tests, when in reality, if they did that, the racial gaps would be even bigger. So I'm all for it. I'm all for removing the culturally biased, remove vocabulary. Let's make the black-white IQ gap 5 points bigger. This is because information and arithmetic is more a function of training, while the more abstract visual spatial sorts of tests are more a function of an underlying general intelligence. And as a result, whites do better on those kinds of tests because whites do better on more G-loaded tests. So all the cultural bias stuff that Pakman is saying here, it's literally 180 degrees wrong. He also talked about brain size a little bit. First off, brain size correlates with IQ today. Overall, the correlation is around 0.24 overall, but if you control for gender, then the correlation is 0.4. Males actually do have slightly higher IQs on average, though not as much higher as you would expect from their brain size, and it's all from visual spatial ability. Incidentally, Inuits, who have the largest brains, but only have on average an IQ of around 91, have visual spatial abilities reportedly higher than any other race. So part of the reason IQ to brain size won't have a correlation of 1 is just because IQ tests don't necessarily weigh the components of your score to reflect how much brain mass each ability takes. Visual spatial ability, while it may take up a huge proportion of the brain, is only one subtest on an IQ test. You could design an IQ test that better correlated with brain size if you really wanted to. If you want to say that these people were faking data, well, it's funny, and it's funny that you brought up Samuel George Morton, because Stephen Jay Gould wrote a book talking about how Morton fudged the numbers and was pushing a racial supremacist doctrine, and Gould was just going nuts about this. Well, guess what? The University of Pennsylvania actually houses Samuel George Morton's skulls, and so 20 years, right, that's 20 fucking years after Stephen Jay Gould's book, Mismeasure of Man, was published, the people who housed that collection went, you know what? Why don't we actually measure the skulls ourselves? And sure enough, they found that Morton's measurements were correct and Stephen Jay Gould was full of shit. Anyway, it doesn't matter because we have more modern studies that produce the same results as the old-timey scientific racialists. I mean, it's this talking point to kind of mock them, but their results have been validated. They got the same results that we do today, so laugh till it hurts, but they were right all along. Throughout the video, Pakman demonstrates a severe misunderstanding of heritability, and I get really tired of having to explain this to people who claim that they're going to do a deep dive. You know, you'd think after he did a deep dive with months of research that we would be arguing at a higher level than this, but no, we're talking about what is fucking heritability. Okay, all organisms are genes expressed in an environment. There is no trait that is X% genetic or X% environmental. An allegory I like to use is cakes. A cake has its ingredients, but also the mixing and baking process. So is the cake a result of its ingredients or a result of the baking and mixing process? That's a stupid question. It's both, and you can't disentangle the two as a cause of the characteristics of the cake. But what you can do is compare two different cakes, and you can say these cakes had the same ingredients, but one was baked longer. That's why it's different. That's why it's harder or softer or whatever trait you're measuring. Or you can say these cakes were baked identically, but they have different ingredients, and that's why they're different in these ways. Similarly, when comparing either two individual cows or two groups of cows, you can, in principle, infer if the differences between them are a result of environmental differences, genetic differences, or most of the time, a mixture of both. But it doesn't make any sense to say the weight of the cow is 50% genetic or 50% environmental. That makes no sense. So when Pakman talks about IQ tied to genetics, no, buddy, you need to sit down. You really, literally don't know what you're talking about. That statement, it's not even wrong. It's like saying the color of 3 is unicorn. We're talking about variation between people and what is responsible for that variation. You can raise Bob and Bill in a compound, and in a compound, Bob's IQ is 110, Bill's is 90, and that gap would be 100% a result of genetic differences, or 100% heritable. But say Bob and Bill weren't in a compound, but were out and about in the world, and out in the world, Bob's IQ was 115 and Bill's IQ was 85, well, in that instance, part of the gap would be a result of environment, or we would say has an environmentality. So inside the compound, we would say the heritability of the Bob-Bill gap is 100%. Outside of the compound, we would say that the heritability of the Bob-Bill gap is 66.6%, and the environmentality is 33.3%, assuming we have some way of inferring this. That's how this actually works. The last thing I want to end on is how oblivious to context Pakman is. He talks about wanting to address ideas, but his video is just a drive-by compilation of the worst arguments arguments against divergent evolution in humans, he isn't addressing anything. It's just a hit piece. I have a challenge for Pakman and all his viewers. Try to go a month without using any of your cult language. You won't do it, but you should try. For example, if I told you Bob is a racist, well, you would ask, why is Bob racist? Me telling you Bob is racist doesn't actually convey any information. I have to, quote unquote, tell you why Bob is racist. But since every time I use racist or white supremacist or even neo-Nazi, I have to do this, what is the purpose of the term racist or white supremacist? If I tell you Bob is a murderer, well, you know what that is. Obviously, you're going to want to know evidence and who he killed, but I don't have to define the charge in the first instance. If I tell you Bob is a piece of shit, then I have to define the charge. I have to say why he is a piece of shit. Racist works the same way. So my challenge for all of you is to try to go a month without using any of these terms, just explaining what it is using real normal language. Now you can respond to me saying, oh, I'm a vested interest, and fine. I get called racist a lot, so I'm a vested interest. Fair enough. But so are you. You use the term all the time. It's a little rhetorical trigger that you like to use. You too are a vested interest in this. And the pattern of racist and white supremacist is very similar to heretic and apostate. It's just a slur. So Pakman comes in saying he wants to address ideas, but then he pulls out all this cult language and calls people who believe in divergent evolution in humans the equivalent of pieces of shit. That's all racist means. Pakman's complete ignorance of the context is also found when he attacked Charles Murray for releasing the bell curve directly to the public and not having it go through the New York Times book review funhouse. Pakman doesn't look like a boomer, but this is total fucking boomer talk. Well, this is the way it's always been done. You let the New York Times tell everyone how shitty your book is before you release it directly to the public. As for what he says peer review, this is such a slimy word. The bell curve was years in the making and was reviewed by hundreds of Murray and Herrnstein's peers. It was peer reviewed. Every paper you see that's not published in a journal, it's all peer reviewed, okay? It just didn't go through some journal review panel. All you're saying is that the 3 random reviewers Nature would have picked to panel the bell curve would be better than the reviewers that Murray and Herrnstein picked. How about this? I declare the partnership of Herrnstein and Murray to be a journal, and their book passed peer review in their journal. Happy? Or how about this? They're a journal and you didn't put everything you say through them. You didn't put everything you say through me. Also, you don't submit fucking books to journals anyway. So like this whole, that criticism is just retarded because these kinds of things aren't submitted to peer-reviewed journals. And my guess is you have never leveled this criticism to any other book, that this is the only book you have ever criticized for not being put through a peer-reviewed journal, even though books never go through peer-reviewed journals. Just shut the fuck up. Oh my God, you're stupid. The lack of self-awareness in this is just breathtaking. The bell curve didn't go through a bunch of fun houses and didn't let my guys tell the public how terrible it was before just releasing the book directly to the public. How about this, Pakman? Before you post a video, why don't you send it to me and I'll post a review of the video before you're allowed to post it on your channel.